Welcome to the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals and the American Academy of Grief Counseling's video on stuck in grief. And unfortunately, many individuals become stuck in grief at a pathological level. This is sometimes also referred to prolonged grief, but I'm not going to so much focus on prolonged grief, but more so being stuck in grief itself or a type of trauma and not being able to escape it and why individuals are not able to escape it. And one of the biggest things with healing are our emotions. Our emotions are outward and physical manifestations of our wounds, our interior wounds, and how they bleed. And through emotions, we're able to bleed and we're able to heal. Now, part of expressing emotions is grief work itself. And through grief, we experience our emotions and we experience them by acknowledging them, not judging them, but working one's way through them. It's when your emotions are bypassed or refused. That's when grief work is halted and healing is stunted. And when the healing process is stunted, then one individual begins to feel like they're trapped within their own mind. Now, some trauma is more difficult than basic grief, obviously, depression or PTSD, for example, because PTSD imprints upon the brain something so horrible that the individual is not able to even process it when it happened. And this occurs due to extreme situations where grief experiences war-torn areas or a violent act or violent crime itself, and something isn't processed properly in the long-term memory. Others remain, though, in a state of loss and trauma by just negatively coping, by refusing to accept the event. They bypass it, and they do not do the necessary work. So as grief counselors, whether at the pastoral level or even the clinical level, we need to be able to help individuals process loss as well as trauma, but to process it in healthy ways. And this is done through various types of humanistic therapies by Carl Rogers, as well as various cognitive therapies themselves. Now, negative coping is usually one of the biggest problems because it prevents emotional healing. It's a bypassing of the emotions itself. Some clients will refuse to acknowledge their emotions and have inherited naturally negative emotional coping mechanisms, maybe from seeing other individuals as they grew up, such as their parents, grieve in a negative way, or maybe it's cultural and they've inherited these negative coping mechanisms. So what happens is one begins to negatively avoid emotion or anything that's associated with the loss of that emotion, whether it's a place or an event itself. This type of bypassing of one's emotion can lead to complications in the grieving trajectory, which prevents healing. It leads to isolation instead, possible prolonged grief and depression, as well as for some turning to other negative coping mechanisms such as drug abuse. Obviously, those suffering from PTSD will also continue to suffer with various triggers that might fire off and lead them disassociated with reality in public places, as well as whether they're home alone. They could any moment have a disassociation episode. But the good news is healing is possible. No one has to be trapped in grief itself. Obviously, PTSD or depression is going to require professional clinical help because it's more than just merely grieving that pastoral counselors deal with, but it's an issue that is much more deeper, much more pathological, and it might even require beyond counseling various medications. But if one is just not moving on, sometimes just talking about the emotions, labeling the emotions, understanding the emotions. So the humanistic approach of Carl Rogers in counseling can be key. And if not going to counseling, to at least label them, to write them down. And that's where journaling comes into play, writing about our feelings, writing about the emotion, what the emotion means, and then in counseling, talking about that, discussing it, and then being able to maybe understand the meaning of it. And that's where CBT comes into play. It can help one reframe what once thought of emotion at one time, but really what that emotion meant in itself. A lot of people can be held in grief by guilt or other emotions that are negative, and unless they're discussed, this wrong interpretation will continually drag them down. In addition to journaling and CBT, therapeutic music or other artistic ways to express emotion or put oneself back into the social sphere is critical so that one is no longer stuck in that grief. So we want to replace negative coping with healthy decisions. And I think that is one of the biggest thing to understand how healing itself can be possible. Well, I would like to thank you for listening today. We are the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals, also the American Academy of Grief Counseling. Our number is 330-652-7776. Again, that number is 330-652-7776. And our email is info@aihcp.org. Feel free to check out our site, as well as please subscribe to our channel so that you can see similar videos to this type of content. Thank you for listening and have a good day.